Dennis, all in favor, the minutes are adopted. All right, I see that we have some members of the public here this evening. So should you wish to speak, this would be the time to do so.
Alex,
Hi, my name is Alex Driggins. I'm just here tonight just to discuss to comment rather on section 1F of the proposed land use bylaw amendments, which is supportive, a combination of supportive housing and personal care home. And as somebody who's worked in the care and rehabilitation of persons with disabilities for a long time, I just wanted to weigh in on the first part of that, where it says, where it refers to the personal care home as being licensed, whereas supportive does not make a requirement for licensing. And out there's quite a big difference in quality of service when facility is licensed versus when it's not. Also the scope of persons served, it mentions in the personal care home, the disabled, the sick, the injured, the aged, and those four very vulnerable segments of the population. So in considering the combination of those two types of housing, I just did want to just briefly touch on those points, just kind of note them for consideration. I was unable to find the proposed wording for the amended version, so can't comment on that. I did want to just with those two.
It appears that there's an intention to combine, turn those into a single definition. You want to speak to this at all? Daniel?
No, I mean, Alex, so there's no proposed new definition at this point. This was just in a review of flagging terms that were similar, that maybe overlap, and we maybe want to look at coming up with a new definition that would capture both. So currently we allow personal care home in I think one very specific area, and we allow supportive housing in a couple other specific areas. And so in reviewing it, I thought we probably didn't mean to say that all personal care homes only happen in this one, and maybe where we allowed supportive homes, maybe we meant to allow, like there should be some overlap, maybe we meant to allow both types of categories in both places. But thank you for your comment and highlighting the differences as well.
For sure. Definitely, I can leave comment details.
Sure.
Anybody wants to know anything further?
Sure. Thank you.
Great, yeah, thank you very much. I must admit, when I read this, I was myself a bit confused, and I felt that there may need to be the distinction retained, but
Sure.
we can speak to that later. I guess that's it for public comments. Moving then into item 4, council referrals, and beginning with the active design guidelines. That will be you, Emma.
I have a quick presentation. These guidelines went to council earlier this month, actually, and it's just making their way around the different committees for comment. The guidelines themselves came from the transportation plan. It was a high priority element to develop guidelines for encouraging more active transportation on the island. Active transportation refers to means of getting around that are active. Most well known would be walking and cycling. Also includes transit use and any other types of mobility that require more human-powered ways of getting around. Active transportation is a big part of a broader concept called active living, and this refers to incorporating physical activity into your daily routine. And that includes how you get around, your commutes, how you move around inside and outside of buildings, and spending time outdoors. When we look at designing our built environment to facilitate and encourage more active living in the community, that concept is called active design, which which is the subject of the guidelines presented for review here.
Can I jump in just for a sec?
Yeah.
It's just a question about the term. So is active design a universal piece of bit of language that's used throughout North America, or? Because I found it it's a little bit misleading.
How so?
I don't know, we're not maybe misleading, but it was unclear to me whether we were talking, but it seemed to be about active transportation modes, but then the document is much broader than that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether, when I read the words active design guidelines, I'm not sure that I understand that has to do with physical activity.
Okay, that's good point. The concept and
Like
term
as you
active
described it in your
design-
first sentence in the presentation, was super clear.
Okay.
So,
It's
so
a design, design approach that was started in Miami, I believe, so it is a North American concept.
right.
It is fairly new within like the past decade or so, but more and more municipalities, jurisdictions are adopting active design guidelines. It's not super established, but it is. And you're correct, these guidelines do cover more than just active transportation. That's the starting point where we started, but there was just so much overlap with active design, and I mean, it's beneficial to the community to incorporate active design holistically in terms of how it affects your normal day-to-day life beyond just your transportation behavior. So we're talking about how you move around your home, how you get from your home to your car or to your other destinations. So I'll just go over the guidelines very briefly, and then we can have more in-depth discussion. The guidelines were broken down into the three main stages of development, so that's planning, subdivision, and building. At the building stage, this is more conceptual layout of where your land uses are and your circulation patterns, and the guidelines here are definitely more high level and conceptual in terms of having a good mix of land uses and various networks, not just vehicle, but also your active transportation networks connecting these different land uses. The next stage at subdivision, when you actually have your legal lot lines on the ground and your road space is defined, the guidelines focus more on having a balanced infrastructure that provide more choice for getting around, as well as including public amenities that make it more welcoming for people to be outside. I'm just listing the general guidelines that fall under these different sections. So you can see it talks about everything from attractive routes to parks. And if you had time to go through them, there's lots of good pictures, a lot of Bowen-specific examples. And the last building stage is for building site. And here we're focused on the single detached family dwelling, as well as talking about public space and commercial spaces. And here we're focused more so about how people get around inside and to and from the building site. And we're looking at deprioritizing the vehicle and making it easier, more efficient, and more comfortable to get around without a car. And also really focusing on all ages and abilities so that people of all different mobilities can get around the building site. In terms of these guidelines, as I mentioned, they've been to council, and now we're just gathering feedback from the various committees. We are planning for an adoption this winter, and then we will have a batch of professional printing and communications materials and bring it to the public in spring. That's a key part of this project because the guidelines really are meant to inform the developers, but also the greater community so they understand what it means to have active design in the community, to encourage active living, the benefits that come out of it, their options, and to create that demand for developers to build with active design in mind. And eventually we would like to incorporate the guidelines in our planning reviews, especially in the discretionary development approvals. And with that, I'll open it up for discussion and questions. I put some general questions that I think the commission might be interested in thinking about, like what does this mean for planning on Bowen? How do these guidelines fit into the process? And are there additional opportunities that we can make use of these guidelines?
Do you have a sample page that you could pull up? You can look at?
I can do that.
Steph has, yeah, thank you.
So it should be in your package as well.
Oh, okay.
I had a question. We're putting together a conservation district policies. And in our research, we found that all layers of government and this whole islands areas really are also focused on trails. And you don't mention trails anywhere in here.
There's actually,
You talk about direct access from a road to a building, but it would be nice to add trails in whenever you talk about direct walking routes. That's not necessarily trails, and we're looking at it in the context of in subdivision when a number of lots are created, that there are trail connections that go to and through and hopefully connect up to other trails in the long term into undeveloped properties. And it's really it's a really an important connection for our transportation system and for creating safe ways for kids to get to school and all that sort of thing. When I first saw it, I was really excited, and I thought, oh boy, this is hand in glove with what we're doing. But then when I started to read through, it was really pretty limited. And it was more, it seemed like you took something from a more urban environment and applied it here.
oh, that was actually a big challenge in developing these guidelines, was actually, we've already reformatted a lot of these guidelines for the rural context and to make them more applicable to Bowen. Definitely trails was top of mind when talking about this and talking about how to get people out and be more active. And when you said that, I was like, sure, we mentioned trails all over the place. But you're right, we would talk about walking networks and pedestrian friendly. And when they say that, it is with trails in mind, but there is no explicit mention of it. So I can definitely go through this and try and find places where we could include like specific places to put in trails.
Yeah, I think under basically almost all these are planning, subdivision, and hopefully even building mention trails. Because we're in our conservation districts, we're looking at preserving natural resources and that sort of thing, and creating trails.
So Dennis, is this a terminology issue? I'm trying to understand what, because I see terminology like walking, under subdivision, for instance. There's like walking paths, and the Parks and Recreation segment, and again, walking routes.
Yeah.
So is it about terminology, like you'd like to see the word trails used? Is that?
Well, where do you see walking paths? I see.
Here, walking paths and
Yeah,
walking
and a
routes.
lot of,
Oh, okay.
yeah, and it is a terminology.
As
but
a direct and intuitive as possible, avoid the need for pedestrians.
Yeah, but
level
I
back and that
agree.
sort of thing, so that's,
Yeah, I agree with
that-
what you're saying, like, when we were writing these, definitely we had trails in mind. We don't have sidewalks in our neighborhoods, and we don't have, any development standards to require sidewalks. It would be a trail.
yeah,
Yeah,
well,
so it's a term I could definitely put in.
yeah, that'd be great, because it really, this sort of insinuates we just want to get a trail to a road as quickly and as possible, and that doesn't really, that's sort of a limited view, I think, of the paths.
Yeah.
But I think there's like the direct route, so like if you think like Kate's Hill has got paths that are the direct route, right? So there's the stairs that come out, because you come down the hill faster, like if you're coming from, you still on Seaview, and it's faster to take the paths down than it is to go the road. So
You'd be
it's
more
like
inclined to walk.
yeah, so it's a direct path to try to get people to a destination faster than walking along the shoulder. So it's not necessarily to the road itself, but it's to the destination. It's saying if you're on Kate's Hill and you want to get to the cove, you can get there
It's a direct route.
It's a direct route that's not along the road, but it's
Well,
it's a path.
we're looking at it for recreation as well, it's just getting you from point A to point B quickly.
And they're probably quite different issues.
They're different, yeah.
Yeah.
They are different, but the guidelines do touch on, like, from the recreation aspect, and these guidelines did go to the Recreation Commission as well, because that is part of active living, getting people out, even if it's for recreation. But these specific guidelines, like a direct walking route, is also important, so that
Yeah.
people are more inclined to walk, or continuous networks, so that, they don't have to hop onto a vehicle road to finish their trip. But things like the third places do talk about recreation spaces. The Parks and Recreation is specifically for recreation. Yeah, so I will go through this and see where I could insert specific mention of trails.
Okay, great.
I would like to make a sort of a general comment. I am flabbergasted by all of these different design guidelines that are suddenly coming to us. That's what it appears to me. And, there's a lot of work being put in. You put a lot of work in. Your committee has put a lot of work into conservation. And they aren't talking to each other. They overlap each other. They disagree with each other. We've also got the OCP. We've got various other building guidelines. And why is this suddenly all coming to us, and how is it going to help Bowen Island? I'm really confused at this plethora of design ideas that seem to be coming. Some of them are they're coming from other places, and all of them have really good merit. But what they do is they add complexity. They don't all agree. Yes, they can be made fire safe if you're conservation. Yes, trails can be the same as walking paths. Yes, they can, it all can work. But where is it going to get us? We've had one subdivision on this island that has gone dreadfully wrong. It didn't go dreadfully wrong because Cape Roger Curtis.
I guessed.
Yeah, and it didn't go wrong because there wasn't a good design. It went wrong because the council turned down a good design. And they turned down a good design because a bunch of people on council at the time didn't want that many dwellings in that area. None of these things are going to resolve that issue. And, I think we're creating complexity, jobs for planners, jobs for developers to have many planners working for them as well. But what are we really doing? We have an OCP, and this is just one little example of how good ideas create complexities that are going to be very challenging for any developer, small scale, or there really isn't anywhere left for the large scale. So it just sort of, it horrifies me.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of meat to respond to in that. Let me begin by saying the overlap is a waste. And I know when we were working on conservation development, we were very keen to make sure that We took into account the transportation policies, the affordable housing policies, and so on, so that there would be consistency. You say that there are contradictions, but we worked hard that there would not be contradictions, and I'm not sure there are any when it comes right down to it. The final point about the legislative function of council, I would much rather have them go off on their own adventure and turn down a good design than to present them with a bad design to begin with. So I think what we need to do is we need to give them a good design, and then if they decide for whatever reason not to accept it, that's what they do. That's why they get elected. I will tell you in our discussions with Daniel, who probably is in favor of jobs for planners. One thing he said, is he in fact emphasized that he wanted things to be clear for him and for the developer, so that when something was presented to him, he could say, you didn't meet this, or you met that, and so on. So insofar as we give guidelines, if we give clarity, then that in fact I think simplifies things. So we have to make sure that we're clear. Concise is good too, if we can do it. But that's the aim.
And consistent.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. Because if we have inconsistency, that makes it very difficult to follow the guideline.
So say, well, like the OCP has policies and objectives about encouraging, so it's like multimodal, so one objective, to promote multimodal forms of transportation across the island, linking neighborhoods with each other to local parks and beaches and to Stone Cove, right? So it's like one, and then there'll be like a policy that'll say something similar to that. And so really what these are trying to do is essentially to flesh out those policies in the OCP, so that we don't end up with a case where we're trying to say, well, does this meet the objective of the OCP? You know, maybe it's a little connected, but it's not totally connected, or it's how much is it? And then the goal of some of the guidelines is to say, okay, now we can look at it. We can say, okay, yes, you've met. We've sort of fleshed out that section of the OCP to say this is what we're looking for, and much clearer then for people when they start, and then for us when we finish to say, yes, you've met it. I mean, and the goal, some of it is there's not many. You know, I can think of there's not many places left where there's going to be big subdivisions, but there's like, you know, like Grafton Lake or whatever the rest of it happens around the golf course, or Arbutus Ridge when they go in, or any of those places where there's still room for more development, to say, okay, what are we trying to achieve in those? What do we want them to do? And we can hand them a document at the start and say, you want to encourage these things, so that when we end up with a finished product, we end up with some of the things the OCD says, and we eventually put it out on the ground to say, yes, now people can actually leave their house, they can walk to somewhere, they get somewhere achievable and come back, and they don't have to drive to the place where they want to go for a walk.
It's
that
in
should be
support
here.
of that.
It should be in here.
In the early 1990s, I spent a few years living on Vancouver Island in Nanaimo, and in the absence of having design guidelines for developers, the development community took their own initiative, and their own initiative typically was to take a parcel of land, cut all the trees down so they could get the lumber from the trees, see what they've got, and then do a development which was pretty unfriendly to the environment and to the user groups often, and to the general kind of aesthetic of the area. It is a guideline. It's not written in stone. I understand what you're saying, Kirsty, if there is a sense that if there are two guidelines for development and they are not consistent with each other, that's inherently problematic. And it's problematic for Daniel because he's trying to encourage a developer to follow certain guidelines, and if the guidelines are inconsistent, that's problematic. So there needs to be some checks and balances here as these things come forward to ensure that they're not, and also I think they need to be non-redundant, because redundancies kind of, you know, just sort of not really helpful to anyone. If an objective is stated in one guideline, it shouldn't be repeated in another one.
And some of it may just be the way the paper moves around, because when we were working on conservation development, I, for one, was not aware that work was being done on active.
Right.
And it would have been, and some of it is just simply instead of using consistent vocabulary, talking about trails instead of walking routes, things like that.
And I
Exactly.
think that's why these guidelines are coming to the planning commission,
I mean,
to point these redundancies out, and so that we don't have an end product that is useful. And just to follow up on what Daniel was saying about the OCP, the transportation plan was a product of the OCP. It has a lot of policies in there to flesh out our transportation needs. Active transportation came to the top of that list. We, as you probably know, we're not an island designed for people to walk around safely, to bike around safely. And the active transportation plan in itself has a very comprehensive strategy for improving transportation on the island to meet the needs of the community. And this was one of those documents. We have in place mechanisms in our subdivision and development servicing bylaw to ensure for better transportation infrastructure. But it's complicated. It's a very thick technical document. Most developers, home builders, homeowners, prospective homeowners, will not be going through a technical document like that. Neither will they be going through an OCP document that is also that thick to comb through it and see what the island would like to see built, right? So these guidelines are to translate those policies and technical requirements into a very easy to use, easy to apply, graphical, engaging, fun to use document for the general public to understand what this island wants.
Yeah, and I think this is all perfectly fine and exciting and heading in the right direction. It's just that I think instead of the whatever direct walking paths and things like that, if we put trails in and just use a consistency of, I'm sure the parks and recreation people would appreciate that too.
I think the conversation raises it raises an interesting question. Are we going to have multiple design guideline documents for developers that they will either need to comply with each individually or choose the one that they're going to comply with and not another one?
Yeah.
I think we run that risk, and I think maybe that's at least in part what Chris is pointing to. And whether we should in fact be looking towards a document that incorporates active design principles and incorporates conservation principles into a single document that would guide, and please comment on this, because we are not, none of us here, except for you two guys, planners.
Well, that's what we have to head towards, I think, is a consolidated planning guideline.
Right.
Subtopic 1, conservation, subtopic 2, and so on.
You're right.
But a single, I mean, that's what we do with bylaws, right? We amend them, but then we bring the amendments into the bylaw and end up with, so that's where we have to head, and I think it's going to be up to staff actually to make sure that we're aware of what's out there and what needs to be brought into the consolidation.
Right.
And to some extent, like the conservation, like as I had read it, was drafted with that in mind in terms of it's like the points were to comply with transportation, right? Policies and the affordable housing policies. So you're sort of flagging those. It's like if you're going to follow.
Yeah, we checked it out. I mean, we just said, yeah, you've got to take this into account, but we didn't know how to take it into account. We think we have.
Yeah, and I think that's, guidelines are guidelines, let's not make it so prescriptive that it's a paint-by-numbers development on an island that is not a paint-by-numbers island. The topography does not allow for it.
So guidelines are an important tool in rezoning typically. In my experience, guidelines are used to enforce or to obtain important amenities for our communities through rezonings. I think that's what they're really applicable.
And there's another legal reason for it too, is if a developer or owners want to challenge the decision made by the municipality can say the decision was made in accordance with established guidelines. Life will go on. So.
Right.
So overlaps to be avoided, but I think it is important to capture ideas.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I think Bowen has had the benefit of some good developments, and they are so because the developer has taken into account some good planning principles on their own without having the benefit of the guideline to guide them. And having such a document, I think, is extremely useful. And I think, and again, as Martin says, obtaining amenities means, having trails through a development that are for the public's use, and not having developments which turn their back to the rest of the community. So there are real benefits to having guidelines which go beyond the very sort of motherhood broad issues that the OCP speaks to.
Exactly, and I just love that paint by number. We're more abstract expressionists here, but paint by numbers.
Well, I hope that's what it ends up at. You know, that, in many ways, some people would like paint by numbers, because then they don't need to think, and it's all just, and you may end up with something that really is not creative and doesn't work. And, you know, anyway, I do really think, and I hear everything, and I think that we have some reasonable developments that were created without all of this. And the one that went wrong, as I say, had nothing to do with guidelines or lack thereof. It had to do with council.
I think one of the things that we tried to do when we worked on the conservation, and we're sort of anticipating that discussion, was bring into it those regional developments that had already occurred, and how did they work, and why were they successful. But I think one of the true tests of good guidelines is that they will allow a suite of creative possibilities that we're not saying to a developer, you have to do it exactly this one way. What we're saying is, there may be a dozen ways you can do it, but you just still have to meet the guidelines and take it from there.
I think what, with the conservation development and with the active guidelines, I think what it is demonstrating is more of an overarching concept. As climate change becomes more evident, people are starting to think differently, and they're starting to live differently. And I think that's the core of what's happening. When you talk about, I don't know why this is all coming now, I think that's the reason, because if people are choosing now to live differently.
Okay?
I think too, Emma and I were just at a meeting earlier today with the design panel, and one of the things we said in that meeting was the goal for guidelines is to raise the floor and not lower the ceiling. It's kind of the goal, so people have great innovative ideas already, so they'll probably already be hitting these, and then it's to raise the floor on the developments that haven't considered it yet. And we can say, okay, when you're starting to rezone, think about these things. Think, okay, I can incorporate these principles.
That's a good way to put it.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's some great ideas in here. I think the document has lots of merit. It would be, and I'm wondering if there ultimately will be a single guideline document for development, or even through the stages of development from, at the planning stage through subdivision through building. Whether that's a series, like the city of Vancouver is rife with millions of little guideline documents for every little nook and corner of the city. So when you go to design a house in the neighborhood, you just go and get their document and you take it home, and if you follow all those rules, you'll end up with the same thing over and over and over again, which I think is what Kirsty's concerned about. Yeah. I don't think anything we've done to date, anything I've seen, is anything like that, and I don't think we're in any danger of going in that direction. Having some good, solid principles that will get us to a place of having good developments, I personally don't think that's a bad thing. I would like to see it being a single document with headings within it. And I guess the question is, when does that occur? Or, is that something where we have several and then we start to consolidate them, or do we start doing that now?
Yeah, and what I was thinking about even in our earlier meeting is right now, we have our website has a policy page, and if you go through it, there's a bunch of policies in there that relate to rezoning stuff. And there's a bunch of policies that relate to our personnel policy or our, any council policies in that one page.
Right.
And I've thought about we have a page on our website that's if you want to develop, so it's it has the land use amendment application form and a flow chart, and this is how rezonings work. And thinking that I should actually start to collect that, as that's the page too of these are the documents that you want us to set to show on all our policies, right? So some of those I know are so the affordable housing policy relates to rezoning, and the green building standards relates to rezoning, whereas the building policy doesn't relate to rezoning. So when people come and ask me about rezonings, right, I can point them and say, I want to think about this one and this one and this one.
Right.
But about collecting them all in our planning department page to say, okay, you're thinking about rezoning, this is the form, and this is how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost, and when we evaluate it, we're gonna think about these things as sort of, the way it's not one document, but at least it's one place.
Right.
Where people can go and say, okay, this is what you wanna think about. You don't need to think about the staff compensation policy, but you do need to think about the green building. But, you know,
Actually, we
should
were
look at different things.
looking after the planners and all of this.
Yeah, no, that's important.
So how many of these guidelines do you think we're gonna have?
Well, I'm just looking on our list. So we have an affordable housing policy. We have a green building standard. There's an economic development policy there for planning department.
Well, that's just for a guideline for the committee.
Yeah, so that's, but again, it's sort of that, I think, it's like this is how we evaluate.
But no, so we have
Yeah.
this active living. How many
Yeah.
more of these ideas are gonna leap out?
I mean, I'd say more often it's like we have the transportation master plan, and we have a parks master plan. And those relate to as, like, on a property basis, definitely the parks plan. I mean, comes out of OCP maps and guidelines, which says, okay, we want a trail across here. So it would relate to your property in terms of, we look at the map and say, okay, your desired trail route, or your desired transportation route.
Yeah, no, I'm really.
Yeah, wondering if there's
specific,
any more in
'cause-
the works.
Yeah, because, like, to me, it's an urban thing. If it was applied to Snug Cove, hey, why not? Because Snug Cove is a dreadful, mess. So why not try and help it with any further development, ferry marshalling and stuff like that? That's sort of where, you know, like, that's where that might fit and be helpful, as opposed to, you know, spread all over the island, and you need to have, you know, straight paths to your house and not a garage or whatever. Like, I don't know, it's just,
I don't think, are we develop any other guide? I mean, we're
Not
looking,
that I know of.
yeah, we're looking at the Snug Cove design guidelines, which are a wonderful documents straight out of the mid-80s, yeah.
nobody can agree to it.
Photocopy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
But-
these are the only ones, and then the Snug Cove is part of a development permit area, so those are different types.
but I mean, I would say ultimately it's kind of up to council in a sense of, I mean, really what the rezoning policies are, is they are, council essentially identifying to people in advance to say, these are what we want to consider when we're thinking about a rezoning. But then ultimately it's sort of up to council, so I think various councils, if we have a green building standard policy, and I think, you know, councils have decided, yes, we want this to be current, or to say, no, we're not actually gonna consider that, and so, but it's council's flag of saying, these are things that are important. If you're gonna get more units, which is normally what it comes down to, it's normally rezoning, so because I want to build more than my zoning is, and we say, okay, these are qualities that we want to see in an application.
Actually, the code design guidelines, we as the APC would like to get in on the ground floor of
What?
that.
If we're gonna be
If we're
tweaking
going-
those guidelines,
If we're going to be tweaking those guidelines.
Dennis and I wanna kick them around.
Okay, so that,
More than-
yeah, I would say that would be up to council to refer them to the APC.
Well, okay, but I mean, there's a whole body of information of walkable and how you create great places and, you know, consistency and ground floor, you know, openness and all this kind of stuff, and, you know, street trees and, you know, the whole thing is really very, very important.
Is that part of the consultation process that staff is doing?
I don't remember, so we have a work plan that's going to council. It just went to the design panel just before 5, I think, reviewing the design
Well,
guidelines.
it's also a planning issue, even though it's not entirely a design.
Yeah.
And anyway, I'm
Yeah,
just putting
so-
it out there.
Yeah, so I'd say that it's probably the next, an APC recommendation to council, that any review of the design guidelines be referred to the APC for the comment.
Okay, by then,
So I'm gonna suggest this is a bit of an aside. We've got a pretty
Yeah.
aggressive
Yeah.
agenda here, so we'll talk to Daniel later about getting around the board with him.
Can I just make a quick closing remark?
Yes, please, Emma. Actually, I have one more question, but
Okay, well, staff is seeking endorsement from the APC on these guidelines, hopefully tonight, if you have time to give them a quick look. It will be a very important document in terms of educating the development industry on Ogowen as well as the general community on the importance of active living and active design in the built environment. It will also be an important document for the planning process on Bowen Island development, as mentioned with the rezonings and other discretionary development approvals, but also at the subdivision stage, as I mentioned, our subdivision and servicing bylaw does require certain transportation objectives to be met, and this document will make it but much easier for both developers to meet those requirements and for the planners reviewing those proposals to see how well they're met.
Thank you. I have a question, just about the format. The ultimate format of this is difficult to, it sort of looks one way on the screen, and looks another way. And now I see that it's paginated here, so is this entitled to a booklet with 8.5 by 11 pages?
Yeah.
So that's 2 pages,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Sorry, I apologize. It comes
No,
up
it's
really
okay.
small.
It feels very dense when you are looking at it, graphically dense, and I'm kind of
So it's meant to be this size,
understood.
and the pages
Right. And it feels a little more
much
comfortable.
easier to read.
Yeah.
This size.
Okay. Any further questions or comments from the commission? Yes, Martin.
Sorry, just like to me, this sort of looks like the beginnings of island-wide design guidelines as opposed to active design guidelines. Maybe that's something to consider, just making it more general.
They are meant to be island-wide.
Yeah.
Are you saying it should, the language should be
Well,
more
there's, there's
specific?
form and character content in here, for example. Right, so already that goes into the realm of design guidelines.
They are design
Yeah.
guidelines.
Okay.
But you're saying the
Semantics,
the
but-
design is more
This
emphasized.
is,
than the
I think
active.
Martin is speaking a little to the question I had at the beginning,
It is.
which has something to do with the terminology. It's something about the term active design guidelines that I didn't initially read into that, oh, you're talking about activity. You're talking about people cycling and people walking and that kind of thing. It's a, yeah, so, and when you read them, there's more to this than just how you get from place to place and what that means,
Yes.
right?
And the very first page, the introduction explains that it's more than just getting from A to B. But I guess I'm still confused as to
Well,
what direction
yeah,
would
so-
you like
so
the
that
guidelines to go.
The comment was really in support of this. This is a great document. I don't know, I just think that perhaps a little bit more general description of the document would probably help it.
Like an introduction?
No, I mean, just
Different name.
different name.
So like active communities or something?
And this may be missing about, but anyway, I mean, it speaks to garage design, for example, which is really form of character. It's an architectural issue. I think my comment's really peripheral to this.
Well, I think it's valid if the title sounds misleading, the general public may have the same response, right? I guess I'm just trying to better understand.
I think this is one of
How
those
it's
things
misleading.
where the term active design may have had a lot of, may have had 10 years within the planning community in North America, and so it's widely understood what active design means. I think to the layperson, that's not necessarily true. And I guess really, it's another reason to wonder if there should, if there's a more overarching document that we're actually aiming for, that these guidelines would be incorporated into, along with conservation planning and some of the other principles.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there could be a little subtext under active design guidelines which addresses what we're talking about here, connections.
I often feel that's the same as having a sign with an arrow on it that says door.
Well,
You're approaching a house, that's kind of like not really good design. If you have to explain to people what the title means.
well, I mean, as you just pointed out, there will be confusion with the lay public.
Well, I suspect there may be. And I guess it's a little bit about, Emma, I think your goal, if we go, we went back to your presentation, but your goal was to have council approve these guidelines in principle this winter, soon, and to actually have them at your disposal as planners working with developers in the spring of 2020, is that correct?
Well, actually, no, it would be public engagement through the spring.
Okay,
So this would be an educational campaign,
right,
not just for developers, but for the general community, to better understand what active design means,
right,
how it can be incorporated into their lifestyle.
right.
But at the same point, like if council adopted it and we started public engagement, we would probably start using it at that point with people who came in, and we would say, this is something council's considering, and this is the direction we're moving,
Right.
as a guiding point for people to say, okay, council may have, adopted it initially and put it out for referral, but they're thinking about it, and, you want to start thinking about these principles.
Right. I have a concern that if this comes to the forefront in that fashion, it'll be a little bit like the R2T2A design guidelines in Kitsilano that were initially developed and then whatever. And suddenly you could only design and build a craftsman house in that neighborhood. I don't think this is quite that tight, but it's almost like, well, the planning department has the first cut of things is active design. That's how they look at development. So you've got to make it over those those hurdles first if you're a developer. And I'm not sure whether that makes sense or whether it makes more sense to try to look at if we have principles that are in 3 or 4 different areas, we bring those all together and give them equal credence.
Yeah. So I think it's premature.
So I think taking to council as a piece like this with our endorsement is fine if that endorsement is a recognition that this will not become a standalone document, but rather will become part of a larger guideline document that would be used by the municipality.
So that would be the comment.
Three.
Just for clarification though, these are design guidelines. I know it's titles is very confusing now, active design, but they are design guidelines, so they're meant to be to influence the built environment.
Right.
Whereas, and I apologize, I'm not actually aware of these other guidelines, like the conservation guidelines that are in progress, and those may be more in principle, conservation principles, and how
Well, no, they have to do with clustering housing and things like that, so they'll in fact build form also. So,
I don't know, to me it seems, I'm actually backtracking what I just said a little bit, because I'm seeing, there's a lot of active lifestyle content in here. I think, if anything, if we ever end up with island-wide, just pure architectural design guidelines, then some of this content may want to move into that document. That's what it is.
yeah.
But that's the consistency issue.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of form and character content in here that may end up in that
they
document.
are design guidelines. And I'm sure even with like the Snug Cove design guidelines that are being redeveloped, will probably reference this document as well. So, I mean, the guidelines don't necessarily need to overlap, but they can be consistent and they can refer to each other.
Once we wander into the realm of form and character guidelines, it's a bit of a slippery slope. I'm sort of with Snug Cove. I think it's actually important to have them. It's unfortunate the ones that we do have, but I think we need to have something. Moving away from what is effectively the village center of the island, my hunch is that we don't want to be getting too deeply into design guidelines that are like that one I mentioned in Kitsilano, which says if their house isn't this color, you can't build. So I'm not quite sure, this has been quite a fluid conversation, and
So I think if I just can, to think about how this would be implemented, at least how we envision it, is so if the first section is planning, that's in essence almost like the rezoning stage. So that's what we look at primarily at the rezoning stage, is like how the lots are laid out, how are they connected? Have you thought about at that initial stage of rezoning that like you've connected them, continuous networks, walking routes, we've got trails, you're giving trail easements throughout this, the development. The next one would be then subdivisions, where it talks again about, okay, at the subdivision stage, again, we're making sure that there's the connections between the places. And it's the third point that goes to the building that says, okay, when you're designing your house, these are things you want to consider. That's almost, I would see that as unlikely that, we would be saying, like the way we would have to capture that is at a rezoning to put a covenant on it, say if we need to build according to these building things, which I see as unlikely to happen.
right.
And I agree, I see unlikely, in our current go-around that we would have a form and character development permit on
Right.
like the rural parts of Bowen Island. And so in essence, it's like, as we evaluate rezoning, certainly we never see like house designs. In some cases, we required house design guidelines, but it's like Stone Cove House, for example, has design guidelines, or Belterra, I think is, so it's like areas closer to the cove.
Right.
And the building side is more than about the encouragement for people to say, okay, think about these things when you're doing it, but not so much that we would be having a check down on like individual houses that are built.
Yeah, that's a good point. And perhaps it is section 3 that needs to be held back.
Well, they're
Because
aspirational.
it's, I'm sorry?
They're aspirational, and they're meant for the greater public to have ideas for when they want to go build.
Nevertheless, it's
The first couple of
it's
things.
not the broad, we're beyond broad planning principles. Now we're saying the kind of lighting you should have in your house should be like this. And I think we're starting to get into an area where Bowen is maybe not ready and probably not willing to have that kind of guideline in place. And I'm only speaking, I'd like to hear a little bit more from your commissioners.
I don't see any of these points that specific. I mean, if you look at them, they're aspirational ideas, but I mean, really, they're just reminders for the developer to look at these areas and develop ideas about them.
And at the
They're
very
not prescriptive
beginning,
in any way.
yeah, at the very beginning of the guide, there's a how to use this guide page. And it talks about the different design areas that are meant to be addressed in each of the guidelines. So everything from the building site to the development patterns, transportation mobility, and how it connects with open spaces and parks. And it also has a caveat at the bottom talking about constraints, understanding that Bowen Island is a
Yes,
very
I read that too.
unique
Yeah.
building space, and every lot, every site is very different. And it talks about how not every guideline is applicable. We understand that. But the intent is to address the design principles.
Well, I just think that the first two things are total overlap with what could be in conservation development if we're gonna go that way. And part 3 is, yeah, it's building guidelines. And I don't think we need it. I think it's premature. And I think it's a strategy in search of an objective.
And I'm a little concerned that the images are, most of them are taken from sort of single-family subdivision examples, and almost none of them have street trees or trails along the front or anything like that. And so, I think people may be, it sort of doesn't match what you're showing as images, sort of what the character of the island is that most people cherish. I wouldn't like to see any of those buildings.
No.
That's the only page without Bowen pictures.
Huh?
I was gonna say, I think that's the only page without Bowen pictures on it. How many pages is the one?
Is that
Oh, yeah? Okay.
page 13?
Oh, that's Bowen, okay, that's one.
Yes, if you go on, take
That's Bowen?
That's fine, that's okay.
Most
Oh,
of
okay.
the pictures are from Bowen.
Yeah, that's what I decided.
Oh, okay.
All of those
Maybe-
Oh, okay.
Maybe it's not the one we want.
No, I was just struck by
Yeah.
these garages and things and.
I think it's
seems like
partly because we shy away from taking pictures of people's houses. So you see more of Bowen in like when it's a path or a park or a street side,
Public
as
space.
opposed to us, we walk around and take pictures of people's houses.
So I'm mindful we've allocated 20 minutes to this conversation and we spent an hour on it, so I think we need
We're
to,
good.
I have 3 comments that I captured.
Okay.
Well, I'm saying that you supporting that they're getting support. Support with the following comments, that trails be highlighted as specific transportation routes.
Yeah.
That the term active design guidelines be reconsidered to provide clarity to the general public regarding the intention of the document. That makes sense.
Mhm.
And that all of the plans be consolidated and active design guidelines be incorporated into a broader document.
Yeah, we aim for that.
That's what
Yeah.
we aim for.
But I think all of the design, or
I
not,
think what we're
it's a
looking-
pretty
what-
bold
what-
statement.
I think these need to be taken with a grain of salt at some point at this level, and that they ultimately will be incorporated into a larger guideline document.
Yeah. At which time they may be subject to further review.
Right.
Yeah.
That will have to be, I think.
It's a very broad brushstroke guideline document. I think it's fine, actually.
But
Yeah.
it's hard to say we're actually in favor of lazy.
I would support
So,
this
after an hour,
I don't,
It's great.
and I guess I don't think that
without
it's,
changing anything.
what I've read of it, I don't find it to be inconsistent with the guideline document that or the guidelines that we were putting together. I
Oh,
think the two can work.
It actually doesn't have any guidelines yet. It's still in the policy.
Right. The policies. But I feel like they can work together. I don't feel that they're, miles apart and we're talking about two different kinds
Well,
of.
I think if we add in the trail issue,
Yeah.
which would be a consistent term, that would be good.
Yeah, so I think you've captured that
I
answer.
think we captured it.
Just one comment, if there's discussion about merging these conceptual documents, I think a transportation guideline should be incorporated as part of that, because it's integral to both of these.
Right.
Do you have cross sections for trails and sidewalks and all that kind
Our
of
our
stuff?
subdivision and servicing bylaw
Uh-huh.
has cross sections of roads and trail. It's the multi-use path, and I think a standard
Multi-use path
footpath.
and
Footpath.
And,
And a footpath.
and the footpath.
But we don't have trail standards right now. That's part of the parks plan. One of the action items hasn't been carried out yet.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a tough one because the trails are on whole different kinds of land,
Yes.
Metro Park.
Yeah, the road standards only apply to road allowance, municipal road allowance.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can make a recommendation to council here. So we've got,
that
wish to,
the commission support the design guidelines.
yeah,
The following comments, that trails be highlighted as specific transportation routes, and that the term active design guidelines be reconsidered to provide clarity to the general public regarding the intention of the document. And we'll leave out the last part. Is that what I heard?
Do we want to see it incorporated with others? I think that's very important, but I don't know.
Do you want to, are you kind of almost thinking the first 2 points, and then it's like that the EPC recommends that, like, that the
Yes.
active design, like as a separate
Like a
point,
different,
that, like all guidelines for rezoning to be incorporated into a single document or something like that?
Would it just be for rezoning or for all
Or all planning guidelines?
yes.
We're talking about future guidelines.
Correct.
Found this
So,
one.
so really, it's guidance for future guidelines in the context of this
Yes.
one.
You say a separate recommendation.
Within which
Yeah,
these would be
separate
subsumed.
recommendation to say,
That's the intention.
So moved.
So moved.
Hold on, so we'll just do the first one, is that this commission supports the guidelines, asking that trails be highlighted as specific transportation routes, and that the term be reconsidered to provide clarity to the general public regarding the intention of the
The term,
document. The term
Active
active design
design,
guidelines be
yes.
reconsidered. Just those two things?
okay, and the recommendations will be separate then? Is that-
Yes.
Okay, so moved by David Rich with the seconder. Dennis, any discussion? All in favor? Opposed?
Okay, hold on a second. Just two?
Yes.
Yeah, the name issue for me is no longer an issue. I think it's fine to call these active design guidelines, as long as we understand that once future guidelines are developed, we will incorporate this somehow with those. And then at that stage, maybe the name will change, or as content moves, or as further articulated.
David?
Perhaps what, since we all seem to be hung up with this term active design guidelines, really what you're looking for, something like guidelines for activity design?
Now, the guidelines for active living.
Yeah, that's what I would.
Active living design guidelines.
Yes.
That's,
So, I think this is a subtlety which I'm confident Emma can work through.
I think, yeah, we'll say Emma's happy to take suggestions by email.
Yeah, right, there we go.
yeah.
And then part two, this was that the APC recommends,
I was gonna say the APC recommends that the active design guidelines be incorporated with any future guidelines or current and future guidelines into a single.
current or future subdivision, or sort of planning
Sorry,
subdivision
and
guide-
subdivision guidelines.
sorry, what did you say? I had the
Okay.
approach. That the active design guidelines? No.
The
All-
APC recommend that the active design guidelines
Yeah, okay.
be incorporated with other current and future planning and subdivision guidelines into a single document. Does that make it clear?
Mhm.
Okay.
Do I have a mover for that? David Rich, second. Louise. All in favor? Opposed? Karen?
That was boring.
Okay, thank you for all your time.
Thank you, Emma. You're still gonna make that ferry, but it's not gonna be as easy as you thought.
You just have to be very active.
Yeah, that's right. Running for the ferry. Okay,
So we are forwarding our approval, our recommendation? or
Yes.
what- Okay,
that was the upshot of that.
okay.
The next item is item 4.2. Acknowledging that we have, sorry, Louise.
I'm going to recuse myself from this item for perceived conflict of interest.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to acknowledge that we have members of the public here who I believe are related to this rezoning application. We actually passed the public comment phase of the meeting before you arrived, but did you wish to speak to your rezoning application?
Don't think so. No.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Should we have any questions? All right. You'd be happy to answer questions if we have any?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, great. So this is a rezoning application for 720 Gardner Lane. Can I hand it over to you, Ben?
Sure.
That's the clicker over there.
So this is just essentially the council presentation that's in, the link is in your agenda, but I'll just go through it here. as well. So this is 720 Gardner Lane. So this is round about the center of the island. So Gardner Lane branches right off of Adams Road, I believe, as you turn left to the little zig. So here we go, Gardner Lane is located here. As the main road comes this way and around Meadowbrook Corner,
Right.
it will go on this way. So in the OCP, it's designated as rural residential. It's a large 20-acre property. And in the land use bylaw, it's got split zones, so it's zoned, a portion of it is zoned rural residential 2, and a portion rural residential 3. But both zones have the same uses allowed, so they allow dwelling and agriculture, horticulture, domestic agriculture, stable, and kennel in both cases. So this is roughly where that zoning split lies. And this zoning split roughly relates to a grade change, so where you'd access this side, sort of the lower part of the property off of Gardner Lane, and it's lower. There's sort of a ridge that runs across the property. And this side of the property does touch Buchanan Road as well.
Is that, well, this is going to come to a question
Yeah.
later. Does that follow the internal road
Yeah, roughly.
roughly? So,
Yeah.
okay, great, thanks.
So the rezoning application is to rezone the RR2 portion of the property to be rural commercial 2 retreat center. So the goal of that, so the applicants purchased 720 Gardner Lane fairly recently to run as a bed and breakfast. So they had run a bed and breakfast and yoga center in Miller's Landing on Bowen Island and relocated it here for additional space. So they built a dwelling and guest bedrooms is allowed in the bed and breakfast use. And a yoga structure to do yoga classes as well. So again, it's permitted to the extent permitted in the land use bylaw, but are looking to expand their operation. So looking for this rezoning to retreat center. So retreat center use in our land use bylaw, this is the definition of a retreat center. So spiritual, cultural, educational, indoor-outdoor program. It allows a maximum of 40 in-residence guests in a single building or cabins, one shared kitchen, eating area, meeting areas, bathrooms, et cetera, et cetera. The RC2 zone then further regulates that there be a maximum of 20 guest bedrooms and 40 in-residence guests. So the application proposes leaving the RR3 zoning on the western portion of the lot unchanged, and that zoning would permit future subdivision to create 2-lot zoned rural residential 3. And they're also noted for consideration. So ROCP schedule for trail use identifies a trail route running up the side of the property to connect eventually to the Crown Land and a cross-island trail that runs along the Crown Land. As well as ROCP has identified a trail that would run roughly up Buchanan Road. And also of note, so we have a current municipal park that runs along Bowen Brook through this park. And so one of the considerations for council and the Parks and Trails Committee in particular is to extend that protection of the park over Bowen Brook as it continues through that corner of the park. And the other consideration that I had flagged for the APC in particular is the balance of the lot, so the RR3 portion of the lot, especially knowing of the conservation development principles that are being developed, and I think that's something the APC wants to recommend on the balance of the lot, is looking at what that future zoning would be. And that's the background of the report, so happy to open it up for questions from the committee.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been working at a retreat center project for the last dozen years in the SLRD, up there towards Whistler, so I have some sense of some of the issues that have arisen. So I guess the first question I have, I don't know if it is in your report, Daniel, but the change to the zoning is going to the retreat, and then there's a definition of what's permitted. Eating areas, meeting areas, bathrooms, accommodation for staff. So is it quite a specific limit to the number of guest bedrooms and the number of guest residents?
Yeah.
And there is not a particular limitation to the number of staff. So for instance, with the retreat center that I've been working on, the SLRD, the zoning there permits 1 staff dwelling unit for every 10 guest beds.
Okay. Yeah.
So there's some kind of, otherwise there's potential here And I don't know why you'd want to have 200 staff, but potentially you have
Right, yeah.
200 staff
Yeah,
serving 20, 30 guests.
yeah.
And then the second question is, what is that accommodation? Is it a dwelling unit? Is it a standalone dwelling unit? Is it an apartment? Does it have, is it entirely self-contained? These are maybe questions that you guys have already thought about, but
So you're speaking, yes, specifically like in our retreat center use definition where we say accommodation for staff.
yeah, what
I mean,
does
some
that
sort of
mean
limitation
exactly,
on that,
right? Are there any limitations on it, in
Yeah.
fact? Or can you have potentially 20 staff and each of them has a house they live in,
Yeah,
right? There's nothing to stipulate here that could not be the case.
yeah. So what the applicants had asked for is zoning to match an existing zone, so the RC2. So they're asking to come into the existing zone with the existing definition.
Understood. I
Yeah.
guess the question really then is, do we, before we say yes or no
Yeah.
to this, do we need to actually refine what
Yeah.
we are describing, what the definition of retreat center is?
Yeah, and that would make sense to me, or the RC2 zone. So the definition could say you get accommodation for staff,
Right.
and the zone could say you get a maximum number of staff, something.
Yeah, because I feel like it's quite a big ambiguity.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how other commission members feel about that, but
Because it's very clear in terms of for the manager or owner, right? It's like one residence for the manager
Correct.
or owner.
And that's-
But you're
that's-
right, but accommodation for staff could be a,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
200
then
person
interestingly,
bunkhouse.
with Brew Creek, they're permitted two. It's a dwelling unit, so it's a house,
Yeah.
permitted for the owner, and a separate one permitted for the manager, in the instance where there might be a separate manager from the owner.
Gotcha.
I'm not sure that we necessarily want to do that here, but I'm just
Yep.
describing that
And
situation.
then how do they deal with the staff, Drew?
We have changed the zoning over the 12 years, but initially it was smaller. I can't remember, I think the limit of beds was based on X number of beds per acre.
Yeah.
And it's a 13-acre site. So it worked out to almost exactly this. And they did it in terms of beds, not in terms of guests. So a bed is a bed is a bed, I guess. That's how, anyway, so the net result was 40 guests, and we were permitted to have one quote-unquote dwelling unit, staff dwelling unit, for every 10 beds.
So a manager and then 2 more houses.
So,
Yeah.
or it could be houses, or whatever dwelling unit is, it's self-contained. So they could be it could be like a little mini duplex that had 2 staff suites in it or something, or, it's a multitude
But
of
2
different.
buildings.
Correct.
Yeah.
They could be 2 buildings, and they're entirely self-contained, they have their own cooking facilities.
Or it could be a dorm.
Or they could be simply in a dorm, which says staff on a drawing somewhere, but then, but you're right, it could be.
So, because I think that would be nice to have that flexibility. I agree that, I never thought that you could have 20 accessory buildings for the 20 staff, but I think that should be managed better.
So is the resulting number of staff actually arrived at scientifically somehow, or is it?
In my example?
Well,
It's interesting because the owners have gone through 3 different waves, where the first wave was they wanted to get as much staff accommodation as possible, and then they had all kinds of problems with having live-in staff and all the issues that arose around that. So then they moved way away from that, and now they're going back again because staff accommodation in the Worcester area is like everywhere, right? It's impossible to find. So offering accommodation to your staff is a big incentive to get staff. And you guys probably can speak to that, but do you have some sense about how many staff you're thinking you would have for the operation?
Honestly, at this time, no. I would say that our intention with the space is to keep it obviously small and careful with bone and so just throwing a number, but I would say anywhere between 2 and 5.
Right.
That's
That's assuming at some point that you were actually able to accommodate 40 guests.
correct. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Drew, what was the name of the place you were?
It's called the Brew Creek Center,
Okay.
and you can if you want to call me tomorrow,
Sure.
we'll talk more about it.
Yeah, yeah.
This definition will affect future developments.
It will,
Yeah, because it's, so I think it's, Xenia is zoned RC2.
right.
These are asking for, and it's sort of been our standard in terms of, we have a couple other areas that are zoned for retreat center, like Rivendell, but it's in a CD zone.
All
And
right.
RC2 is like our nice standalone zone for retreat center. So if anybody came to, for a retreat center, we would say, yes, you want to be RC2,
Would
because that's
Xenia
our.
be, how many buildings does Xenia have? I've never been to anything. Like, are they gonna be out of,
I would check before changing this to say, okay, this seems like a loophole maybe that, you know, we'd want to make sure that that's somehow restrained. We'd want to check that we're not then making, like, we're not putting them into trouble and then we're not.
Xenia,
so-
yeah,
so
like they'd
they're-
have to be grandfathered and it's all a big mess,
Yeah.
yeah. Because they've really grown organically.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna suggest that as an alternative, we could do this as a CD zone, but I don't think we wanna do that right
It's always my goal, and somehow I always end up in a CD zone.
now. I know. We need to stop doing that. So, yeah,
Where does water come from? You've got wells?
Well, we have two water licenses. One is on a spring, which is our primary source right now, which is very abundant. And then we also have rights to the creek technically, but we don't want to be using that. And then there's also surface well kind of back property. Again, we don't really plan on using that.
So you have lots of water?
Yeah, there's lots of water.
Because
Yeah,
you're in the drain hole.
That, we are right in the bottom of that hole, yeah.
Yeah.
One of our issues in Miller Landing is water, so we wanted to make sure we found some place. And that was pretty good.
so, just stepping back a little bit globally.
Yeah.
Ultimately, there will probably be 3 parcels, if that's how this looks, is that correct?
No, so, our focus, right now is retreat center, zoning in terms of just our life and our business, we're bringing people, and for everything we have into this and trying to get it up and running. In terms of the rest of the property, you know, and obviously Daniel and I had pretty, conversation on this and where our heads are after that. All I can say right now, and we have no definitive plan, all I can say is that in our sort of, based on our philosophy of what we would like to do with this property, is that a baseline for whatever ends up happening to the rest of the property would be like a, let's call it the John Reed development style. Like that would be the base, and hopefully we would do something better than that in terms of offering what the community needed at that time. There's nothing that jumps out to us right now, and we don't know what we could or would want to do with that at this time. But
So initially.
it would be something dire that have to happen in our life in order to just split it up into 2 5-acre lots and golf courses. That's not our intention.
Right. So initially, it's simply going to change, the zoning will change on the RR2 piece, and you'll maintain the entire parcel with split zoning.
Yeah.
Is there any requirement, how does the split zoning work? Is it not required to actually parcelize it?
We, in our land use bylaw, we say we can't create more split zones.
Right.
Or we can't create a new lot that is split zoned. So council can rezone something into multiple zones, but then when it comes to subdivision, you have to subdivide along the zoning boundary. But there's no requirement unless council were to say that that's a triggering point and they want like the subdivision or the rezoning to be contingent on a subdivision, council can require that. But,
Right.
but as a rule, no, it would just be rezoned and then it would be in the future when you subdivide.
So I'm not quite following. So can we do what we're asking?
Yeah, so we can rezone, the one portion and leave it as one lot, and just have the split
So
zone.
it is a subdivision then?
So
It's
the,
not a split, it will no longer be split zoning on one large lot. It will be 2 lots with different zoning.
no, sorry, so the rezoning would change that RR2 to be RC2,
Right.
right? And nothing else, so it would continue
So
as
it's-
one big lot.
One big lot with split zoning.
Yeah, so I'm saying council, like if council, it was an issue for council, we could put a condition on the rezoning to say, well, you have to subdivide into the split lots, but I wouldn't see that.
Okay, so that answers my question. Yes, Dave?
Has council asked for any amenities for the rezoning?
So the one that was flagged at the introduction, so one was, as part of the initial application, the applicant had offered the trail to connect up this way, knowing that there's an existing municipal trail that runs along here that comes out to Gardner Lane to connect up. And then in our initial review, what we flagged for the applicant and for council was that on the property to the south, we had taken a municipal park that was essentially the Bowen Brook riparian area. And so looking to continue that through along the existing Bowen Brook. And the applicant was okay with that, provided that we would then need easements for access over that park to get in, so they weren't cut off and it wasn't and also then that, because right now this area is the exact size to be the RC2, the 4 hectare, and knowing that, okay, if a park dedication came out of that, we would still want to be able to create the same number of, like the same zoning, and still be able to create an RC2 parcel at the end of it, and not take that away as a part of it. But that's what's contemplated. And this is going to the Parks and Trails Committee tomorrow to specifically talk about trails and parks.
So I have, it appears, but it's a plan, so it's difficult to know. The SPIA is going to kind of run through here, and is there sufficient developable land to be, I presume, north and west of that too?
So the new dwelling, it's right in here, I think, and the new cabins kind of run, and I'm gonna point them wrong, but sort of in here and then up on this side of it as well. Right, so yeah, Drew,
Are these, is that somewhat accurate diagram of what's intended, or?
Yeah.
So the other thing that I was wondering about, and again, this goes, it goes to the RC zone, and which is the related parking.
Okay.
And because in the parking section of the bylaw, the rural zones for retreat center, there is a car parking space required per guest room, plus 1 per 2 non-resident employees. So again, there's, and it doesn't even speak to the owner and whatever. So presumably if the owner has a single family home, they have to provide one or something. So the question being, so there's going to be a minimum of 20 or 21 parking spaces, and assuming there are some staff, there will be more. Parking takes a huge whack of land. It's just, it's a big sort of. So I guess my questions are, if we're going to look at the retreat center zone, just to make sure that everything's, all the I's are and T's are crossed, we should look at reference to the parking, how it relates to that as well, because it does refer to the employees. And I guess the other question is whether we want to contemplate a reduction in the parking requirement, whether that's too overly onerous.
Yeah, what was it?
1 per guest room, whatever that may mean. So assuming that there's a 2 guests per room, would be kind of a logical sort of assumption. So 40 guests means you've got 20 parking spaces.
Plus the owners,
plus the owners, plus employees, yeah, exactly.
Do you allow basically gravel parking in a situation like this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think maybe in the code would require pavement, but if we were, and in fact, probably this is in a development permit area, so it's any development needs a development permit about impact on watershed. So we'd almost be requiring gravel or
It has to be
packers.
permeable.
If somebody's putting a paved park, they probably trigger more things if we're worried about that.
Good.
Okay, I don't know, were there other comments about this application? You're looking for a recommendation, Daniel?
Got just 2 notes on the, did you recommend it proceeds. Recommend that council proceed with the rezone application without a limitation on the number of staff dwellings be identified, similar to as guest dwellings. And that parking requirements be
Reviewed.
Did I miss anything?
Well, actually, sir, one question, is this really just for residents, the retreat center, or will do you plan to be running like yoga for non-residents as well, or is it just a retreat, really? Or is it
well-
flexible?
Both. So currently we do offer yoga to go-net vendors, and we have classes, like community classes that people come to. And then we also have classes that are catered to our guests. But even in those classes, we welcome the Rhode Island community to come. So it's for both.
Okay, I asked that question because of the parking issue.
Yeah.
So it's not like Brew Creek is really a standalone facility for well, I guess people go for weddings, so, yeah.
Weddings are something that occurs there, but there are retreats as well.
But do people come in for day classes sort of thing?
It can happen that way also. It's a bit tricky. There are two meeting facilities there, meeting buildings, which designed were built, and one of them has an occupant load of 120 people, and the other has an occupant load of about 75 people. And so a question arose, do we have to provide parking
Yeah,
for those buildings over and above the guest resident parking?
that's why I was asking that
And
question.
the determination was no, that if there are guests there, they're using those facilities, so we were not required to double our parking requirements for that. And I think that's a reasonable.
Yeah, but you do need some extra if you're expecting day guests.
I think that's just a prudent thing to do.
So anyway, that's just to
That's it, like,
inform.
when reviewing the parking,
Yes.
consider
Know that it's,
like day users as well as overnight.
yeah,
Exactly.
Well, I would imagine they would provide enough parking if they have guests. So, we're talking about review to see if you need more parking, you say? Or
The
less
parking as is defined in the bylaws related to the number of people there.
Yes.
So if we don't know how many staff are there, we don't know how many parking spaces are needed.
Well, my guess is if they're just building gravel parking spaces, they would just create enough spaces that they need, would they?
Yeah, I think we
would they
need
not?
to define what that is. I think there needs to be some kind of definition of that. Otherwise, you run the risk of, there's a big event there, and there's not sufficient parking, and then there's parking on neighboring park properties or, nearby, and people walking to the venue. Yes.
Okay, a comment. This is not specific to our situation, just giving for general knowledge, I guess. Like, and using our business example. So currently, we have 50 parking spaces, and that's the B&B portions of 5 cottages. And then obviously, we have some community classes time on the weekends. And we're finding that, generally speaking, have at least 4 or 5 extra spaces. I think that speaks to some of the changing. So one of the reasons we love this property is we're on the bus route. To encourage our guests to take the bus as much as possible.
Right.
So we find that, anywhere from around 30% of our guests take the bus, which is great. And then, of course, people ride share and whatever else. We're finding that parking needs are decreasing, and we hope that continues to happen. Obviously.
Sure, no,
So,
I absolutely agree. And I trust that the planners will come up with an appropriate answer to that question. So, sorry, did that answer your question?
Sort of.
Sort of. You don't want to have any parking requirement at all?
No,
You want them
I'm
to
just
decide
saying,
what they need.
I don't think we need to be reviewing it to make them add more parking if there's already a parking standard.
And all I'm saying is the parking standard is related to the user group, and the user group is undefined. So the other side of the coin is, if they built 50 staff houses, they have to provide 50 staff parking places.
Yes.
That's what the bylaw says.
So the bylaw may be too heavy rather
It
than
may
too
be.
light.
And I'm open to leaving to the planners to determine how many are needed. I just think there needs to be consistency from the one part of the bylaw to the other relating to the zone.
Create 50 jobs on the island, that'd be great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, David.
I was just wondering, Mr. Chairman, concerning the time, that we seem to have covered all the possibilities. I'd like to make this recommendation. It's in here.
Yes.
That the Advisory Planning Commission recommend the council proceed with the rezoning application at 720 Gardner Road.
And I would like to see that amended slightly to include, subject to review of the zoning, the RC2 zoning by the planners.
RC.
Yeah.
With respect to staff housing.
Was the number of
With
staff
respect to
hours.
staff accommodation, yes.
That sounds like something that should be done anyway,
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
not
yeah.
Right.
specific to this proposal. Yeah.
The number of staff.
But it may be one thing needs to happen before the other thing.
Yeah.
Just say number of.
Which may not be good news for these folks, but it's,
Yeah. Members and parking requirements. And just, yeah.
how's that reading that stuff?
That the commission recommend the council proceed with the application, subject to, the review of RC2 zoning by planning staff in regards to number of staff dwellings and parking requirements.
Or maybe staff accommodation.
Yeah, accommodation, because I think we need to define what the accommodation is also. That motion, anyone like to make that motion? Kirsty, second. Michael, all in favor? Carried. Great, thank you very much. Moving on to item 4.3, 375 Cardena Drive. This is kind of a mess, isn't it?
It's a complicated one.
We have a second.
Would anyone be open to my opening a window?
Yeah.
Oh, God, thank God.
I'm just feeling it's hot, I'm almost warm enough.
Oh, really? Oh, no. We have blankets.
I know.
Our thermostat is in the hall and the main furnace vent is in here. If these doors stay closed, then it heats up in here and it never heats up in the hall where the thermostat is and it never turns off. It's a great system. There's no downside.
Are you involved in the retreat?
Pardon me?
Are you involved in the retreat? Is that why you accuse yourself?
No, they're things in the public house.
Yeah, just hold it for
Yeah, sorry.
375
Okay,
Cardena.
so our second rezoning application tonight, so it's 375 Cardena Drive, also known as the Bowen Island Marina. So location, here in this, it's got our layer of it, but at the foot of, opposite the ferry dock, a property that also extends into Snug Point area. So some background, so these are the buildings on the dock. And this one's showing the new seating area around that building. So in terms of, tonight our theme is split zoned properties. So this property is a combination of the BC2B zone and the SR2 zone itself. So in terms of SR2 zoning, it's a fairly standard zone across Bowen, but for this it allows one dwelling and it allows one accessory residential use, which means a secondary suite, and in this case an attached secondary suite so there's not more than one permitted on the lot. And so what they've applied for in regards to that piece is, so the existing house that was on the property when the owners purchased it had 2 secondary suites in the basement, one of which was, so this one on this side was larger than the permitted 90 square meters, so they applied for and received a variance from council to allow the secondary suite to remain. I think it's 115 square meters, so it's a couple hundred square feet larger than permitted secondary suite. And then this secondary suite, they're applying as part of this rezoning to be able to reinstall a
So to be
secondary suite.
clear, this exists
Yeah,
and this is proposed.
yeah. So then going to the second half of the split zoning, the VC2B zoning. So that's looking at this side, so it allows assembly, it allows land-based marina facilities, and then storage of marine fuel and boat launching. And so I'm gonna highlight land-based marina facilities is a whole list of stuff. So it's used to be upland adjacent to a marina for marina offices, retail use associated with marina, such as convenience foods, ice, fishing tackles, basic marine equipment, supplies, and crucially here it says, and takeout food.
No cappuccino,
Yeah, well, takeout food.
take out food.
Take
Yeah,
out.
food. Yeah, and then in terms of what buildings are allowed in this zone, we have buildings and structures limited to 1 gazebo, and those buildings and structures located within the zone and approved for construction by development permits, 2 development permits issued by the Islands Trust in 89 and 95. Highlighted there. So then this is this 95 development permit. So you look at permitted 1, 2, 3 buildings that exist on the property. But since this development permit issued, at some point the previous owner had connected between these buildings 1 and 2 to create that 3rd retail space in the row, as well as extending an addition up the side of this building for a staff washroom. So the rezoning proposal then was to allow an additional secondary suite within the SR2 zone, to amend land-based marina facility to permit seating within food establishments. So right now it allows takeout establishments, and they've since constructed seating arrangements, and at what point you no longer take out food if you're interested in food. And so to amend the zone variation to permit additional buildings that were constructed. So in all cases, this rezoning application is about permitting what has taken place and allowing it going forward. So in this case, the bathroom extension of the infill building, not including that development permit. And then I've starred the infill building in terms of our building inspector had flagged it during the review to say they had serious concerns about the code considerations, so that if council said, yes, you're allowed this infill building, that would still be subject to code considerations, which in his opinion would be possibly taking it out due to fire separation concerns.
These were built as storage sheds and they're now being used in commercial kitchens and
so yeah, so in terms of these 2 things, I think would be flagged through so in 2019 we started requiring business licenses we hadn't previously, which involves checking occupancy and zoning of businesses when they apply. So that's when up till then we've had no system of requiring permits and occupancy of businesses. So now we get to discover all these fun things. So that's the background of the application, so I'll open up for questions or comments.
I think it would be useful to deal with the 2 zones separately.
Sure. Yeah, so maybe if we focus on the SO2 first as a sort of...
Sure, let's talk about the house first.
Yeah.
Why do they want a second suite? Well, that's what I would like to know. I mean, is it about money, or are they just, they're benefactors and they want to create housing on loan for
Probably both are true.
like,
But it's multi-owner still, isn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
So so it's not one owner that needs one
Yeah, so
house.
there's 4 of them, I think.
Yeah, 4 or 5, so,
Yeah.
or renting.
I wonder if that's what, would it be
there's no precedent for this whatsoever, and there's
No.
nothing in the OCP or zoning or anything that would allow for a second suite in this house.
No.
So I'm not sure why we're entertaining the idea. Because there's a need for housing in the development.
But that raises the question, are they looking to rent it out, or is it just for...
I think that's an excellent
They're
question.
looking to rent it out.
They are, okay.
Pretty clearly. So they rent
On a long-term or
Like
short-term basis?
Yeah, and I don't know if that improves or deteriorates.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, on a long-term basis, so even our.
Do these two suites have anything to do with their marina operation, or is this just something that would be another avenue of cash flow?
Yeah, it doesn't relate to the marina,
Right.
other than it connects and it's on the same property.
It's not like people who come in on their boats can then come and stay,
Yeah.
so it's not related to that. Okay. So, doesn't that open the door? If one place can have 2 suites, why can't I have 2 suites?
You could apply to rezone for 2 suites.
Right.
Can I ask a question? I thought at some point in here, you had said the secondary suite can be allowed despite policy 171,
Yes.
but I don't know what that is.
Policy 171 was in the OCP. It says staff has determined that allowing a second secondary suite is not inconsistent with policy 171. And policy 171 says, notwithstanding any policy in the OCP, the snug point area will remain a single detached dwelling area. No other forms of housing will be supported in this area.
So that was an initial flag for us in reviewing.
Right.
So they gave us policy, the square one. My computer died. So it's not our meeting's going on too long.
Yeah. You times it.
Yeah.
So, do we need them to explain why they are a special case? Is that?
Yeah, I'd
But
like to
this
know
is
what
about-
other special case. I mean, there are.
This is not floating. Sorry.
There are other, there are building code issues too. I don't know, I guess with a single suite, we haven't been requiring fire separations and that kind of thing. But now you've got 3 suites in this building.
Yep.
Now we want to see fire separations, we want to see sprinklering, the whole 9 yards.
And septic.
And then septic would be another issue as well.
Are they on code-based sewer?
Is the house. The marina is the house. I don't know. I mean, so definitely the code, again, with this is with the other side. And the code considerations are there. They have an architect who's been working with them, and so we've made clear that if the zoning goes ahead, that we still need a code compliance report as part of it to
Right.
allow the second suite.
Right. So, yeah, that's not really our business anyway. It's really a question of whether it makes sense to open the door to having more than one accessory suite in a house.
And how would you feel about it if a couple more in that area asked for it? Like, just sort of like, is this, maybe it's good to have 2 suites with every house in an area that you don't need any transportation to, and you sort of end up with apartments. I'm not saying yes or no, but.
Well,
I mean, to some extent, I think that would be my feeling. I think just as a housing planner, that having an extra suite within Snug Cove would be a benefit. There would be a need for rental housing on Bowen, and this would provide.
There may be good security too in that location.
Have you had any, since I presume this has been published in the newspaper, and have you had any feedback from the neighbors?
Not so far. I expect I will, and I think that would play into
Have you,
council's.
notifications?
We haven't sent notification, no.
But this was pre-existing, the second, it's a
Yeah,
reinstall.
so it was, it was existing at the time they bought it, and at the time they were renovating it, was when we'd flagged it and stopped it, essentially.
They have enough parking?
They have parking, yes. Well, I mean, the parking's a weird one too, because the parking, it's all in one parcel. So the parking, there's parking off of, like, adjacent to the house, and there's parking,
Down
in
by the
the marina, and in our parking bylaw, either of those would satisfy.
Right,
either.
you could share it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Whether that's practically makes sense.
In general, I think that's a good idea. If they want to go through all the code issues in building it, I think it'd be a good idea to have another housing unit there.
unless it was just be used on the weekends for boarders.
Yeah, or if it becomes just part of a, vacation rental,
Yeah.
then it's not really a benefit to the community.
Can we address the
Yeah.
tenure issue?
I think so.
Yeah.
Like the APC could say, you support an additional accessory residential or whatever, the additional secondary suite in this property, provided that the property not be allowed to be used for short-term rental.
Sure.
And also, which I guess it's without saying that the neighbors are okay with it.
Well, they'll get notice, I guess, eventually.
Yeah.
Right.
So basically, I mean, where we are in the process, I guess, is
They probably don't
introduce
want
the
to have two
council.
suites themselves,
Introduce the council for referrals to committee, to
Right.
come back to council for a bylaw, and we said at that point, one of the conditions would be that the applicant hold a, information meeting before even,
Right.
there's like a formal public hearing, but we're saying before that, once we put the first reading to go to the neighbors for.
Yeah, I don't think we need to worry about,
I mean, they want it in, I think it would say in part because it was there when they bought it, so it's sort of a.
They count
They
on
would like to
the
provide
income.
rental housing.
I don't think we need to worry about the neighbors. I think that will resolve itself. I think if we can stipulate the kind of tenure that we are anticipating, that seems then having more, presumably, hopefully affordable housing in the cove seems to be a benefit.
That might be the way to say it, rather than talk about short-term or long-term, just say that it contributes to affordable housing in the cove.
I think we want to stipulate.
You do want to
Yeah, I
use,
think so.
okay.
If you say affordable housing too, then I start thinking, okay, then we'll put a housing
No,
agreement
no,
on
no,
it, right,
no.
that stipulates
Right.
Yeah.
affordability and tenure
No.
and everything, and you're saying you want it to be long-term rental and not short-term.
Yeah, I think if it's long-term rental and it's gonna go to marketable there, if they want to try and get $3,000 a month for that unit, good luck.
But what does this say about the other suite? Can it be used short-term?
I mean, currently in our zoning, if you have a secondary suite in a property, the entire property can't be used for bed and breakfast or commercial guest accommodation. So that's captured right now. Having said that, it's in only the short-term rental consideration going on that council's considering. So if that were to change, but this, like if this ends up being, which would have to be a zone variation to say you're allowed 2 secondary suites, then the zoning would then say, okay, and like none of the property, none of the SR2 zone, like this zone could be used for commercial guest accommodation or for short-term rental. So it would say both suites and the main part of the house, all of them could not be.
And that might turn them off, they might retire their application.
Do we have any other
Call it bluff.
places on Bowen, houses, private homes that have 2 suites in?
I mean, not that they are zoned for and are permitted for.
Not that we know of.
Just the illegal ones.
Right, only illegal ones.
But there are other multifamily, they're not dwelling place, not houses, but there's lots of multifamily accommodation in the cove. And, I think if this were not in the cove, I'd think a little harder about it.
If it's on a transportation route, then I think it's probably something that we should support.
Yeah.
Yeah, it ticks off all the conservation development boxes, assuming it is long-term rental.
Okay, so regarding, maybe we'll make separate recommendations to council. Let's make a recommendation regarding the SR2 zone and the second suite. Recommendation that the APC supports the second, how's it described?
Maybe this is
Second
what
secondary suite.
allowance of a
second
secondary suite?
A tertiary suite.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and maybe if we write it like that, because that is what we're saying, is yes, they can have 3 suites.
Right.
Secondary.
And-
I know it's weird saying secondary suite, but then at least it's clear, like in terms of our zoning.
Right.
Subjects,
I called it tertiary suite in other meetings.
you got booed.
Well, no more to say, I reconsidered, I think, using
A second secondary suite,
subject to it being used as a long-term rental.
correct, subject to it being used for
Yeah.
long-term rental.
Just
Well,
a question. I mean, if it opens up to more secondary suites, what pressure does that put on the resources or the capacity of the municipality?
I mean, you're right, in terms of if we're doing it across a wide area, we would want to consider like water demand or
sewer demand potentially. Like if we were to say everybody in Cove Bay could now have, have 3 units on their property instead of 2, we would want to do some sort of analysis of the water resource.
So does this open up the potential for that?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say our interim director of engineering had just done a review of the Cove Bay system. I mean, it's happened, even like the Grafton Mike is part of their rezoning did it, and so he did another one for the potential sale of Area 1 of Lot 2. And said essentially through that, he's not concerned. He said through this, he's not concerned in terms of it's
There's lots of volume.
right, adding
Pressure's a problem.
Yeah, so adding a, essentially a single bedroom secondary suite, he's got no concerns over it.
That already exists.
Yeah, that has existed. So it's not, in that sense, it's like, we're permitting it now, but before the water demand was already.
I think the other units are gonna be in trouble with parking and stuff like that. Like, this one is lucky because it has double areas, but that road around there, like,
Yeah.
it's challenging enough for the single.
Yeah, like for every house on Snug Point, if every house on Snug Point came and said we want to add 2 secondary suites, I don't think it would work.
No.
I think this one, given, its location, it's like, essentially it's walking route even to the marina and to the cove, so that, the neighbors can only get out going all the way around. And this one, you could see this one likely being somebody who doesn't have a car could live there, because that's part of the attraction for it.
They
is
can
they're-
walk down through the marina.
They can walk through the marina and they're at the ferry.
It is unique in a number of ways.
Now, could they, if we put a restriction on the suite, the long-term rental, could they turn around and say, okay, we'll live in the suite and we'll rent the other?
Well, like I said, I would put it
Sure they
on,
can.
like in terms of
If you
how
put it on the
I
whole
would
thing.
craft the bylaw, is I would put it on this SR2 portion of it and say this is SR2E or whatever we're up to. And the zone variation would be that it allows an additional accessory residential use and it doesn't permit,
And,
any
also
sort
the
of,
short-term
so it would be
rentals.
the main house and the 2 secondary suites would say you're not allowed to do the short-term rentals.
Perfect.
Okay, so we have that recommendation now, Steph?
Yeah, well.
I wanted to move this forward. We still
Yeah.
got stuff to do.
Well, I've got that the commission recommend that council proceed with rezoning application RZ02-2019, 375 Cardena Drive with the following comments. Regarding the SR2 zone, that the commission support the allowance of a secondary suite subject to its being used as a long-term rental. And then I thought I'd include the next piece, the next
Oh, I
bullet,
see.
or did you want to?
I see 2 separate recommendations. Or do you
You
want
see
one?
two
May as well. Yeah, I guess
Two
that's
suites,
cleaner
two
than-
recommendations?
Then close off the first part.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Do I have a member for
Yeah,
that?
let me just-
Dennis, second.
Martin?
Martin. Okay. All in favor? Opposed? It's carried. So let's talk about the other zone, the BC2B zone. So if I understand this correctly, this is really just trying to get all of the stuff that's currently there, which is non-conforming, into some kind of conformance.
Yeah.
And nevertheless, there's a whole bunch of messy bits, but it's actually not planning mess. It's going to be more about building code
Yeah.
violations and all kinds of other things. Because they're running operations there where they don't have sufficient washrooms, they don't have exiting, they don't have fire suppression, they don't have, it's like endless lists.
Yeah, I mean, when they first came for business licenses, and our business license inspector opened their building file and said, uh-oh, we've got issues, because now you've got, buildings on the side that don't have permits, but you don't hit any of the, like, the coastal health stuff, because you don't, but they can't do any work on the buildings, because none of it meets the zoning, because the zoning says you can only have those buildings that exist. So they're sort of been caught in a cycle.
Have
So
they expressed a wish to do renovation work, to bring them up to code if possible, or?
yes, and they've hired an architect for local, so Ben Park has been hired by them to do the work on it. Having said that, I don't, if they get the report and it says, okay, to have the middle, like for example, to have that middle retail unit, you would need to do whatever to the walls and stuff, right? I don't know if they're willing to go to that level.
So if they get the zoning, what,
So if they get the zoning, they would need then, they're in a development permit area, they need a development permit for form and character for the buildings. And then they would need a building permit for the buildings, and then the businesses would need business licenses to operate.
well, the board,
There's no danger they'd be grandfathered in on the development permit process?
No, because they were never, like, they've been within a development permit.
Okay.
but they would be, the development permit is only form and
There's
character
only form and
guidelines.
character. Yeah,
And, you know, probably board and batten siding and shake roofs will fit them into the 1970s guidelines, and that part will be a non-issue.
yeah,
The rock wall are gonna hit is gonna be around the building code,
yeah,
and that's gonna be a big, big deal.
yeah.
Because those are A2 occupancies right now, and they're in sheds. So, and I guess that's the question, I mean, is there anything that's really stopping them from continuing to operate?
Under the current, so,
I'm saying this, I actually really like that there are some activities and things on the pier there. I think it's really actually a great thing for Bowen. I think it'd be a real travesty if there weren't something there like that. But I don't know where this is all going quite.
yeah, so currently our policy in terms of the business license, which would be the primary thing that, like, you know,
Right.
where it needs
You
to
can't
go.
have a business license if you haven't got a proper building permit,
Yeah.
an occupancy permit for your building. Right.
And so currently, council's direction has been that it's about educational awareness of our bylaws, and that if people are working towards compliance, that it's not enforcing it. So in this case, you know, they've applied for the rezoning, which is the first step that they need to come into compliance, so they've applied for it and it's working through, so we wouldn't be enforcing our business license bylaw on them while they're still actively pursuing a rezoning to come into compliance.
Right.
If it were rezoned, would that open up potential for further development? I mean, because there's undeveloped
Yeah.
part of the lot.
I guess it would depend on what the rezoning would be. So, you know, one option would just be to say where it says building structures are limited to these buildings. You could say their buildings and structures are limited to, you know, shown in Schedule F, and we get a new plan that's just the current buildings. And that would say, okay, you're still left with your current footprint. Or we could see a zoning that says, okay, you're allowed a lot coverage of something that works out to what they have now, or so that allows them to reconfigure it without needing to rezone.
I would think that would be the way to go. Like, it sounds like they're gonna run, whether it's today or in 5 years, the building code is gonna shut them down. And so they're gonna need to do something, and then to give them flexibility to do enough that they can afford to, that it doesn't just have to go away, to Drew's point, that it's great to have something there. But not, I don't mean
Yeah.
huge lot coverage,
Yeah.
but to contain them to what they have now is probably not gonna work for,
I could see it being a little bit denser.
yeah,
You know, that there could be 4.
yeah. Nothing wrong, and probably that would be very nice, and it would maybe give them the potential income to be able to redevelop as opposed to.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to limit them to the buildings that are there.
Yeah.
I think that would be, if in the end they have to rebuild, we could even get something that's a little more attractive.
But aren't they limited by the proximity to the water?
In terms of setback, you mean? I don't know, it's an interesting question. Typically there are setbacks from the
Yeah.
ocean.
We have setbacks to the ocean.
But it's
So I
also,
believe, like, this zone, and I think the other marina, I can't check right now, but I believe
Sure.
that they talk about setback to the sea differently,
Oh.
because they are essentially,
Built on top of.
they're essentially built on top of the water, like,
This lot that's above the houses, is that their property as well? Lot 19?
It's lot 19 this way, yeah.
Yeah, lot 19 is connected to the stuff down the front.
Like, so if you see here, this says lot 19 as well, so it's all, like, this is
It's
all
all
lot.
lot 19.
Yeah,
It's just a cliff, isn't it?
yeah, but it's lovely technical drawing from 95. Cliff is in here with the S's
Right.
showing steep.
Bench.
No, it sounds
I
like.
guess.
Tree. Bench.
Like bench, tree.
This
bench.
really is a building code enforcement issue. This was constructed illegally
Yeah.
or renovated illegally, and, you know, it has to be dealt with that way. Building department.
Yes, I agree. They're seeking compliance with the existing zoning, and
It's up to the enforcement to ensure that that happens as soon as possible.
so I'm sensing that the APC supports the rezoning.
Yeah.
No, that don't make it
That's all we
really
gotta say.
constrained.
Do we want to build into it something about density provision or lot coverage or something?
So it would be the APC support the VC2B rezoning.
To accommodate existing or new buildings.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like I was thinking maybe the way to do it is instead of this current wording, you know, maybe it has a floor area and a lot coverage amount. That
Right.
somehow lists it, and so it's saying you can build this much.
Yes,
That's maybe a bit more than what
And don't
they
make it
now
too
tweak
constrained.
it, Yeah.
yeah.
So it's not like you can build a lot, but it's like, okay, if you're gonna have to reconfigure stuff.
Well,
Somewhere there's-
they're going to be limited by parking, actually.
There's already built into the zone, there's an allowable FSR of 1, which I thought, that's good.
That's quite high, yeah.
Interesting. And a maximum building height of 4 meters, so it's gonna eat up a little bit of lot. But
Yeah, if they built that, but then we say, but you can only have 3, right?
So then, and then the other one kind of takes a lot away from them, it says, but you can only have what you have.
Yeah.
So I don't think we want to give them back all of them,
No.
we want to just change the wording so that they can have a little more density than they have.
Yeah, and if they need to, like if the bathroom is here, and right now a little staff bathroom.
Right.
And if we say, well, actually now in code you need 2 staff bathrooms, or whatever it may be, I don't know, or you need a public bathroom and a staff bath, or something.
Yeah,
But they
sure.
don't need to come back to a rezoning to change the map to add another line on the
Right,
side. That
right,
has some sort of
exactly.
flexibility.
You know, I could see, I mean, do we have some sense of what the 3 buildings is?
Sorry, which?
What the floor area of the 3 buildings is?
I don't think I've included it anywhere. I think I may have it in the file, but not that I remember.
Because I could see having like a third, you know, in that,
Equivalent.
where there were currently 2, there could be a third SRU there as well.
Right.
I think that would
The other thing that I've been considering is that, so after first reading, we're gonna require an information meeting, and is to require some sort of code compliance report as well at that point, before second reading.
Right.
In essence, to force almost consideration of it, so that they know going before the public hearing, okay, if I get the rezone, I'm gonna do all these things.
Yeah.
And if that proves too much, then at least, then we know that we're gonna need a second plan at that point.
And the land-based marina facilities uses takeout food covers pretty much whatever they've got going there. So there's no need to tweak things anymore. It's really just about getting these buildings compliant, and potentially if they want to rebuild, they could have a little bit more density.
Yeah, I mean, I would tweak the takeout food requirement. We've had many discussions with them, I think, about what exactly, you know, it's like when there's stools inside the building and you still have takeout food
All right.
facility. And I would like some sort of clarity in terms of
So they're permitted to have seating associated with their.
yeah, so that the seating is definitely permitted.
And again, I think that adds to the ambience, so I
Yeah.
don't have a
Yeah.
challenge with it. How are we doing, Steph?
Do they have bathrooms for their marina somewhere?
No,
I don't believe so.
but nobody lives aboard it.
That's interesting. You think so, they have bathrooms with showers and stuff.
I just have a commission support the VC2 rezoning to accommodate existing new buildings.
Well,
So-
why don't we just recommend approval of the zoning change? And I think if they can squeeze on some more buildings there and still get the parking, more power to them. They can, of course, there's the height limit there.
Is it height limit for a reason? Like, is it because of blocking views, or is it just there?
I mean, I would think so, because in terms of, because it's specifically 4 meters, and generally our standard is 9 meters. So obviously when the height limit was put in, it was put in to say it's gonna be lower than.
4 meters would give you a conventional kind of store or something.
Yeah.
You can't get 2 stories out of
Yeah.
it.
Where's the 4 meters measured from though? Is it from the dock?
It would have to be from
From the
the
bottom?
finished grade, yeah.
Or
That's a good
From the
point.
grade,
Oh,
Yeah.
or from the depth of the wharf.
Below the water.
Check that.
Yeah. Well, can we say something like we support the rezoning, and with an eye, or, and if it allows more density or something, leave it to Daniel to write something up if we go forward, but then and we're not opposed to higher density, on
And
this.
support.
How about to allow for the existing buildings, and if new construction, to allow an increase in site coverage of 25%?
well.
Something like that. That's gonna give them, that would give them one more.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, what did you say, 25%?
Of existing buildings,
Yeah.
not of
Yeah,
lot.
25%.
So,
25% of the existing buildings, yeah, exactly, yeah, not of the lot. Although actually what they have right now is they've got 100% of the lot. Because the zoning,
what's allowed,
FSR1 is the whole lot.
So if we just cut, like if all the zoning did is just cut this section, this little D, then it would revert to and say you get an FSR of 1, which is the whole lot. You could have a 1-story building that took up the whole property, in theory, in the zoning. And then we'd say, where's your parking? And then we'd be all fight. But
So is 25% enough? I don't know. That's.
Well, 25% of what they have now. I mean, it's gonna give them, potentially then they could have 4 shops instead of 3. And I think would be a nice goal. And I think if they want more, then they should come back and
Okay.
negotiate that.
And is there a concern about what the wharf can handle in terms of structures on it?
That's
And
really
whose
not our,
responsibility is that?
it's not really an
that's
APC.
that's essentially the building permit
Yeah.
point, is like, they're gonna build more buildings to get engineers to certify that it's strong enough. Yeah.
yeah.
So it's theirs, like the wharf is
So
actually their
It's
property?
theirs, yes.
Okay.
I mean, you go to all these cities around the world, and that's where the really nice restaurants are,
Yeah.
looking out over the harbor and into the sound, and so, I don't have a problem with, if they have the ingenuity of being able to put, 2 or 3 more buildings in there,
I don't know.
that they should be able to do it.
Or if they have
And
2
with-
floors and a nicer view
Or
from
two,
that,
or
I
two,
don't care.
or 2 floors. The VC2 has a, 1 FAR?
Mhm.
So that, why not just leave it at that?
Just take the clause out regarding the buildings and say, if they want to build more, they can build more.
Well, we just give them the straight VC2 zoning.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying, Dennis.
Yeah.
Because the last clause is the one that it negates what's said before, right? So the FSR1 doesn't mean anything because they're limited to 1 gazebo and the buildings and structures that are there.
Oh, okay, yeah, take out.
So you take
The limit.
that out, then the FAR1 comes back into play,
Yeah.
and they get that.
Yeah.
And they can have a whole lot more building than they have.
Yeah. I think that's good, because that can be an exciting place. Right now, it's really a backwater. And it's, not many people go over there and use it, but it has real potential.
pretty busy the other day when I went to tell your friends.
But yeah, but yeah, I think that's a nice idea, and if they're never gonna be able to afford to do all that, but it gives them that allowance to do something creative that's gonna spark up the cove with a.
I mean, do
How does
you want to say
does the-
something like you support the rezoning and the VC supports additional development?
Yeah,
at,
in this
you know,
area.
in the VCTV zone or something like that?
Yeah,
Just
I think-
leave
I
it
think-
like
I think
big
so.
picture to
Yeah.
Do
say.
you feel
Yeah.
confident that the parking requirements for the marina and the uses that are there will be the constraint that will disallow them to come anywhere close to an FAR1? You understand my
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
let's-
yeah,
so
so
yeah,
you're
so
not
that-
saying
that-
you support, but you just in general, you support more development
Yeah.
there, and you're
Right.
pretty much sort of vague as
Yeah,
to
so
what-
let's
how
say
much is
that.
more.
And also support having defined outdoor seating areas.
The commission support the VC2 rezoning and support the additional development in this area and
Would support additional development in the areas.
and having defined outdoor seating areas.
Yes.
And allow seating for restaurants, or, I mean, because some
If
of
it's
them
indoor,
have-
outdoor,
And
yeah.
Yeah, if it's not,
permitting,
remove the restriction on takeaway only.
Okay,
do we have indoors?
If they can fit it in a few
They
seats
fit it
inside.
in,
Great.
inside the building and outside the
So
building,
just
then
define
fine.
seating areas.
Okay.
Allowing, it's clear there.
Permitting.
If the owners had enough money, would this arrangement allow them to build a restaurant along the bottom and accommodation on top?
no,
No, because it
the
needs to be.
building height is not high enough for 2 stories.
But there are no houses behind them that would look over top of a two-story building.
That would be fantastic if they had restaurants and
Why
houses.
would the height be restricted? If you look at that part of the houses above, or well up above.
Yeah, that's because the height restrictions for that zoning, it doesn't take into account the fact of the cliff. So if they sought an amendment of that, they might get it just on the basis of the fact that there is nobody whose view is blocked.
Well, should we recommend allow,
I don't think we should do all of their heavy lifting for them. I think they should
Yeah,
come
well,
back
they
and
can
say,
work it
we
out."
want to do this.
Yeah.
They've asked for something, let's do that, we'll deal with it, and
okay.
they can come back. We don't need to design a development for them.
That just
But we
spends
want-
money already.
Yeah, they're facing a lot of expense.
Well, that's why I think they're gonna have to do a lot more than they have now, because they're
Yeah.
gonna have to
Get the
rebuild.
income and so,
Yeah.
This is site-specific
Mhm.
zone,
Yeah.
so, I mean, we could change it. We can recommend a change to the building height.
Yeah, I think, at home, but
What do we need, 6 meters?
2 stories, 7 meters.
7 meters.
Yeah, at least, yeah.
or just say we're open to, or I don't know,
Well, I think we need to write it in.
do we,
the ordinance.
exactly what,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I was thinking that's why it was broad enough to say you support additional
yeah.
development.
Right. And leave it at that.
And leave it at that in terms of.
Yeah, because we're.
Because
That's
I think,
easy.
like, for, I think for us, to, like,
Back of the lots.
yeah, to zone and allow additional development, we would want to be considering the things like, how's your parking gonna fit, and what are your servicing domains?
But we aren't gonna say, and you have to do it all within 4 meters height.
Well, I mean, but so in terms of this application is just for those existing things, and they can do it within the 4 meters height. And you're saying you support additional development, which
Yeah.
is kind of encouraging to say, to the person to say, so one, the zoning to allow a little bit more room, and two, for the applicants to say, okay, there's support for me to think about or come up with
Go
new
nuts.
plans.
Right.
And they have sort of broad level talk to me about, okay, what else would we like to do? But their focus was, okay, let's bring what's there now into compliance and operate it, and then, you know, what
Yeah, they might want to
We
all
can
be
have-
commercial, maybe what they wanna do is have, I don't know, dining, rooftop dining,
Yeah.
who knows? I
It'd be
mean,
fantastic.
so, yeah. So how's that looking now, Sarah?
Support rezoning, VC2B rezoning additional development in this area and permitted defined seating areas.
Or remove the restriction on, as opposed to,
And remove the
And supports removing the restriction on established.
takeout only.
Does it take out food?
Yeah.
Food and
Get rid of
beverage.
the defined seating area?
So it could just be remove the restrictions on takeout food and seating. And you can sort through the details. Do I have a motion to that effect? Dennis, second. Kirsty, all in favor? Okay, we're unanimous.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
can we go home soon?
You had an idea,
I have a recommendation, is that if it's okay with Daniel, we defer his list.
Yeah.
Because
I think you guys waiting for that?
No.
They were, yeah,
But I think the conservation district is in good shape. We were sent away, we met with Daniel, had a very productive meeting, we made some modifications to it, and everybody seems to be happy.
Okay.
So,
You can go home if you vote for it, Kirsty.
I'm not, yeah. I'm not necessarily saying I'm gonna do that, but,
Well, we did take into account quite a few of your comments, actually.
So this is item 4.4, conservation development. And this would be
So what is the motion attached to this, that it be
forwarded to council.
voted to council for their consideration?
Consideration, yeah.
This is
Oh, there it is.
Pages
Council adopt, no?
20
Oh, yeah.
to 33 of your. Has everyone had a chance to go through and see the revisions? If so, we have a motion to recommend the council adopts the conservation development policy. Michael, do I have a seconder? David, any further discussion? Haven't had any discussion. It's getting a little bit punchy. No further discussion? Okay, then I call a question. All in favor? Opposed? We have one opposed. So it's carried. A motion to defer the proposed land use bylaw amendments to our next meeting. From David, second, Dennis. Daniel, are you okay with that?
yeah.
Okay.
I'll just say that it's here, I'll probably tweak it and fiddle with it before next month, but if you have any initial thoughts that you've thought about or written down, feel free to send them my way, so I can
Okay, I
incorporate
have
them.
two things you can, one is the word story, like the story of the building, is not defined in the bylaw, and I wonder if it should be. And I'm wondering where the front lot line is if you've got a road adjacent to two property lines. And is one of these kinds of housing co-housing?
Of all those, no. co-housing is
Supportive,
different.
personal care home or supportive housing, none of those is co-housing.
No, co-housing is a separate definition.
Is a separate, is defined separately here.
Yeah.
The term co-housing in OCP and in the zoning bylaw the definition is identical. Just that one says means and the other says refers to. So I read that correctly. Mr. Lynch?
I move the meeting adjourned.
Seconder? Kirsty, all in favor? We are unanimous in that decision. Everyone can go home. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I know this was, and that we might want to be elsewhere. I did have one, now that we're adjourned, I did have one request. This was too much to deal with. I was in a workshop for 4 days.
That's enough for that camera, I'll be right back.
Too much to do in a short